Welcome back to WSE English Story, where learning English becomes a journey through the most inspiring true stories in history. Today, we travel into the heart of ice and silence, to the very edge of the world, Antarctica. It is here that one man, driven by unshakable courage and quiet determination, changed the boundaries of what humans thought possible. His name was Roald Amundsen, the first man to set foot on the South Pole. This is not just a story about frozen winds and endless snow. It's a story of vision, sacrifice, and leadership, of a man who dared to dream beyond comfort, beyond fear, and beyond the known. Through Amundsen's eyes, we witness what it means to dedicate one's entire life to a single goal, and what it costs to achieve it. As you listen, you'll not only improve your English skills but also discover the power of endurance, planning, and faith in one's mission. These are lessons that echo far beyond the icy plains of Antarctica, lessons that can guide you in your own journey, wherever you are. If you'd like to support our work, you're always welcome to like, comment, share, or join us. Your support helps us keep creating meaningful stories that connect English with inspiration. So, get ready for an extraordinary adventure into the white wilderness. Let's begin the story of Roald Amundsen, the first to set foot on Antarctica. At the end of the 19th century, when Europe was racing toward modernity and discovery, Norway was a small, sea-loving nation surrounded by cold winds and vast fjords. The sea shaped its people, sturdy, patient, and brave. Among them, born in 1872 in a quiet village near Oslo, was a boy who would one day carry the hopes of explorers across the globe, Roald Amundsen. His family came from generations of ship captains and fishermen. His father, Jens Amundsen, owned a fleet of ships and hoped his son would follow a safer, more educated path, perhaps as a doctor. But from the very beginning, young Roald's eyes were fixed on something far beyond the shores of Norway. When he read stories about the great Arctic explorers like John Franklin and Fridtjof Nansen, he felt a fire grow inside him, a fire for the unknown, for the silent and shining poles at the edge of the earth. Life in Norway was not easy. The winters were long, the nights dark, and the cold seeped into every wall. But that very harshness prepared Amundsen for what was to come. He learned resilience from the land and patience from the sea. His mother, worried about his health, kept him away from the ocean for years. She wanted to protect him. But protection was never what Roald wanted. He craved challenge, and the thrill of testing himself against nature. When his mother passed away, Amundsen was 21. With her gone, nothing held him back. He abandoned his medical studies and turned toward the path he'd always dreamed of, to become a polar explorer. It was a daring decision, one that would define his life forever. Yet at that time, exploration wasn't a profession, it was a gamble between life and death. The world was changing rapidly. Britain and other European powers were racing to claim territories, while science and navigation were advancing faster than ever. For explorers like Amundsen, the poles were the last great frontiers, pure, untouched, and brutally unforgiving. To reach them was to touch eternity. Amundsen began preparing himself not with glory in mind, but with purpose. He studied the diaries of explorers who failed, memorized their mistakes, and trained his body to withstand exhaustion and cold. Every journey into the wilderness of Norway became his classroom, every storm his teacher. In those years of quiet preparation, the seeds of greatness took root. Can you imagine what it feels like to chase a dream so dangerous that almost everyone believes it will kill you? For Amundsen, that danger wasn't a warning, it was an invitation. And soon, he would accept it with all his heart. From this calm beginning, the winds of destiny were gathering. The boy from Norway was ready to take his first step into the frozen unknown, and the world would never be the same again. When Roald Amundsen first set sail as a young man, he quickly discovered that the world of exploration was far harsher than the romantic stories he had read. The sea was not a place of glory, but of silence, danger, and endless uncertainty. Every voyage carried the risk of never returning. Yet Amundsen was drawn to it, as if the frozen winds whispered his destiny. In 1897, at just 25 years old, Amundsen joined the Belgica expedition, a Belgian journey to explore the Antarctic coast. It was his first real test. The Belgica became trapped in ice for over a year, turning the ship into a drifting prison in the polar night. The crew faced scurvy, starvation, and despair. Men lost hope. Some went mad. The temperature never rose above freezing, and the sun disappeared for months. It was the kind of isolation that could break the strongest spirit. But for Amundsen, this nightmare became his classroom. He observed everything: how the ice shifted, how supplies were rationed, how leadership held men together. He watched their mistakes and quietly vowed he would never repeat them. While others grew weaker, he stayed calm, collecting knowledge like a hunter gathering tools for survival. That experience taught him one truth that would guide his life: success in the polar regions depends not on courage alone, but on preparation and discipline. When he finally returned home, he was not famous. There was no cheering crowd, no celebration. Exploration was still dominated by the British, and Amundsen was just another Norwegian sailor with frostbitten hands and a stubborn dream. But deep inside, something had changed. He had faced death, and he had not turned away. He began to plan his own expeditions. To raise money, he gave lectures, wrote letters, and worked tirelessly to earn the trust of sponsors. But money came slowly. Norway was a small country with limited resources, and few believed in funding risky adventures to the frozen poles. Every rejection cut deep. For a while, he lived in near poverty, dreaming of ice while sleeping on thin mattresses in rented rooms. Still, he refused to stop. When the opportunity came to lead a small ship called the GJOA on a new journey, to find the Northwest Passage across the Arctic, Amundsen seized it. The mission was bold, almost reckless. No one had ever completed the route. The Arctic had swallowed many before him, including the tragic expedition of John Franklin, whose men vanished without a trace. Everyone told Amundsen that he was risking his life for nothing. But he had learned that progress always begins with those willing to fail. As he prepared for his first command, he wrote in his journal that he felt the weight of both fear and freedom. He knew that every man must face his own ice, that invisible line between ambition and death. This was the beginning of his great struggle, the stage where dreams collided with reality, and where a young man's belief in himself would be tested by forces far greater than he could imagine. Soon, the Arctic winds would reveal who he truly was. In the summer of 1903, Roald Amundsen finally stood on the deck of his own ship, the GJOA, a small wooden vessel no longer than 70 feet. It was modest, far from the grand ships of the British expeditions, but for Amundsen, it represented freedom and destiny. His goal: to navigate the Northwest Passage, the fabled sea route that connected the Atlantic and Pacific through the Arctic's frozen maze. The journey was perilous from the very start. Ice threatened to crush the ship, storms tore through the sails, and temperatures dropped so low that even breathing felt like swallowing needles. Yet Amundsen led with calm determination. He believed that courage was not the absence of fear but the mastery of it. Every morning, before facing the day's dangers, he reminded his men, we are here to learn, not to conquer. For 2 long winters, the GJOA was trapped in the ice. Supplies dwindled, the men grew restless, and hope faded. But Amundsen turned hardship into opportunity. He spent months learning from the Inuit people who lived in the region, their hunting techniques, their clothing made from animal skins, and their way of reading the snow and wind. He observed how they survived without fighting the Arctic, by working with it. From them, he learned the secret that would later make him the most successful polar explorer of all time: respect nature, and it will guide you. He trained his men to wear fur instead of wool, to eat seal meat rich in vitamins, and to move silently across the snow on sleds pulled by dogs. The Inuit laughed at their first clumsy attempts, but soon Amundsen's team could travel farther and faster than any European expedition before them. Every skill they mastered was a small victory over the cold. Every night they survived was a step closer to the unknown horizon. In 1906, after 3 years of relentless struggle, Amundsen's ship finally broke through the last barrier of ice and reached the Pacific Ocean. The Northwest Passage, a dream that had cost so many lives, was now open. Amundsen had done what even the British Navy had failed to do. The world celebrated his success. Yet for him, it was not fame he sought, but knowledge. He had seen the true power of endurance, teamwork, and preparation. Standing on the deck of the GJOA, watching the cold waves roll beneath the pale Arctic sun, Amundsen felt both pride and emptiness. He had achieved the impossible, and yet, a deeper challenge called to him. The South Pole. The untouched heart of Antarctica. A place where no human had ever stood. Could he reach it before anyone else? Could he claim the final frontier for Norway, and for all humanity's spirit of exploration? The Arctic had taught him survival. The South Pole would test his soul. And so, with quiet fire burning inside him, Amundsen began planning his next great journey, one that would demand not just skill, but absolute devotion, discipline, and sacrifice. By 1909, Roald Amundsen had earned his place among the world's greatest explorers. The GJOA expedition had proven his courage and leadership, and Norway saw him as a national hero. But Amundsen himself was restless. He was not a man who could live on past victories. He needed a new horizon, something greater, something final. At that time, the race to the North Pole dominated every explorer's dream. 2 Americans, Robert Peary and Frederick Cook, both claimed to have reached it. But Amundsen doubted their stories. He decided to find the truth for himself. Quietly, he prepared an expedition to the Arctic, or at least, that's what the world believed. He gathered funds, supplies, and his trusted crew, and he secured a ship called the Fram, the same vessel once used by his hero, Fridtjof Nansen. But destiny has a strange way of changing course. When Amundsen learned that both Cook and Peary claimed to have already reached the North Pole, his heart sank. The glory he sought there was gone. Yet, in that moment of disappointment, a daring idea was born, one that would change history. If the North Pole had already been claimed, then he would go south. To the bottom of the world. To the South Pole, where no human had ever set foot. It was a radical, even reckless decision. He knew that the British explorer Robert Falcon Scott was already preparing his own grand expedition to the South Pole, backed by national pride, royal support, and scientific ambition. Amundsen had none of that. He had only a small team, limited funding, and a dream he could not let go. So, in a move that shocked even his closest allies, he kept his true plan secret. He told his sponsors and even his crew that they were sailing north, until they were already at sea. One night, under the quiet sky of the Atlantic, Amundsen gathered his men on deck. He looked at their faces, loyal, curious, unaware, and finally told them the truth. "We are not going to the Arctic," he said calmly. "We are going to the South Pole." There was silence. Some stared in disbelief, others laughed nervously. It was madness, the most isolated, freezing, and deadly continent on Earth. But Amundsen's voice carried such conviction that no one protested. They trusted him with their lives, and he had never failed them before. In that instant, their fate was sealed. In September 1910, the Fram left Norway, heading into the unknown. When Scott later discovered that Amundsen was racing him to the same destination, he felt betrayed. The two men never met again, but from that moment, history became a race between them. A silent duel played out across thousands of miles of ice. As the Fram pushed southward through the dark, icy seas, Amundsen stood alone at the bow, staring into the mist. He knew that from this point on, every decision would determine life or death, not just for him, but for everyone who followed him into the white abyss. The turning point had come. The race for the South Pole had begun. And beneath the southern stars, Amundsen's quiet determination hardened into something even stronger, destiny itself. The Antarctic night was endless, a world of white silence stretching beyond imagination. As the Fram reached the Bay of Whales in January 1911, Amundsen and his men faced the purest form of isolation known to humankind. The ice groaned like a living creature. The wind howled so fiercely it tore skin from flesh. Yet, in that frozen emptiness, Amundsen felt at peace. Every breath of icy air reminded him that he was alive, that he had reached the true edge of the earth. They built their base camp and named it Framheim, home of the Fram. For months, they prepared, organizing supplies, training the dogs, and mapping every possible route toward the pole. Amundsen was meticulous, almost obsessive. He checked every sledge, measured every ounce of food, and adjusted every plan for the worst that could happen. His men admired him, but they also feared his silence. He spoke little, but when he did, his words carried the weight of ice and destiny. Meanwhile, far away on the opposite side of the continent, Robert Falcon Scott and his British team were also preparing for their journey, though in a very different way. Scott's expedition relied on man-hauling and motor sledges, a reflection of British pride and technology. Amundsen, however, trusted nature, dogs, for clothing, and the knowledge he had learned from the Inuit years before. The difference between the two men was not just in methods, but in philosophy. One sought victory through endurance, the other through harmony with the elements. By October, after months of darkness, the sun finally returned to the sky. The men cheered, but Amundsen remained focused. On October 19, 1911, he gave the order they had been waiting for: "We start tomorrow." 5 men, Amundsen, Olav Jæland, Helmer Hansen, Sverre Hassel, and Oscar Wisting, set off with 52 dogs and 4 sledges, carrying supplies for 80 days. The temperature hovered near -40 degrees Celsius. Every step was a battle against fatigue, frostbite, and despair. There were moments when even Amundsen doubted himself. The compass spun uselessly, the horizon disappeared in blizzards, and the sound of the wind was like the voice of fear. Men stumbled and fell, their faces covered with ice. Some of the dogs collapsed, and they had to make painful decisions, to sacrifice the weaker ones to feed the stronger. It was a brutal necessity, one that haunted them all. Amundsen later wrote, We did not take life for cruelty, but for survival." Still, the men pressed on. Every mile forward was an act of faith. Amundsen led from the front, skiing silently, guiding his team through the endless white. He was not only fighting the elements, he was fighting time, knowing that Scott was advancing from the other side of the continent. It was a race against both man and nature, and the stakes could not have been higher. Then came the final climb, the last great barrier of the journey, the Queen Maud Mountains. Glaciers towered like walls of glass, and crevasses split open beneath their feet. Ropes snapped, sledges tipped, and one wrong step could mean death. Yet they climbed, inch by inch, until they stood upon the vast plateau that led to the South Pole itself. On December 14, 1911, after 56 days of struggle and near silence, Roald Amundsen and his team raised the Norwegian flag at the bottom of the world. There was no crowd, no applause, only the soft crackle of the flag in the wind and the endless white around them. Amundsen stood motionless, his face hidden by frost, and whispered, "We have achieved our goal, and may the honor belong to our country." In that moment, there was triumph, but also sorrow. The land was too silent, too perfect. The victory felt sacred, but heavy. They had won the race, yet they also knew they had risked everything to do so. As Amundsen wrote in his journal, "The greatest joy is not in reaching the goal, but in the journey that demanded our whole being." Can you imagine standing there, at the end of the earth, knowing you are the first human ever to do so? What would you feel? Pride? Peace? Or the quiet realization that some dreams cost more than we ever expect? For Amundsen, the South Pole was not just a destination. It was the point where man met nature, and where ambition met humility. The battle was over. But the legacy of that frozen triumph was only beginning to unfold. The return journey was no celebration. The South Pole had been conquered, but the white continent demanded payment for every triumph. The temperature dropped lower than ever, winds screamed like living things, and the men moved through a blizzard that never seemed to end. Still, Amundsen's leadership never faltered. He calculated every stop, every meal, every hour of rest. His discipline, precision, and calm made survival possible. The men followed their markers back through the endless whiteness, pulling their sledges, protecting the surviving dogs, and relying on the caches they had left on the way south. They spoke little, saving their breath for survival. Some nights, they huddled together in their tents while the wind tore at the canvas, whispering stories of home just to stay sane. Amundsen listened but rarely joined in. He carried within him the heavy awareness that triumph and tragedy often walked side by side. After 99 days, the team finally reached Framheim. Their faces were unrecognizable, bearded, burned, and scarred by frost, but their spirits were unbroken. They had traveled more than 1,800 miles through the most unforgiving land on earth, without losing a single man. It was a feat of endurance and precision unmatched in exploration history. When they sailed home aboard the Fram, the Norwegian flag waved proudly over the deck. The impossible had been done. News of their success spread like wildfire. When Amundsen arrived in Hobart, Tasmania, in March 1912, he sent a simple telegram, "Beg to inform you, pole reached December 14, 1911. The world was stunned. The headlines called him the conqueror of the South Pole. Norway rejoiced, and for a brief moment, the small northern nation stood at the top of the world's stage. But glory can be cruel. Just as Amundsen basked in the quiet satisfaction of his triumph, news arrived that Scott's British expedition had also reached the pole, but tragically too late. They found the Norwegian flag already standing in the snow. On their return journey, Scott and all his men perished in the blinding storms. When word of their deaths reached the public, the world's sympathy turned toward the fallen British heroes. Amundsen's triumph suddenly seemed cold, even controversial. He felt the sting of this reversal but refused to let bitterness take root. "We each serve in our own way," he said. Scott served honor. I served success. Yet inside, he mourned his rivals. He knew how much they had sacrificed, the same price he himself had narrowly avoided paying. His admiration for their courage was deep and genuine. Over the next few years, Amundsen continued to explore. He sought the North Pole once more, navigated the Arctic by airship, and dedicated his later life to advancing the science and safety of polar travel. But the South Pole remained the defining symbol of his spirit, the proof that humanity could overcome even nature's harshest barriers through intelligence, teamwork, and respect for the world we inhabit. When he stood before audiences across Europe, speaking of frozen seas and endless nights, his words carried more than adventure. They carried a message that the true victory of exploration is not about conquest or fame, but about expanding the limits of human possibility. "The land of ice," he said once, "teaches you the truth of yourself. There, you cannot hide behind words or comfort. You either endure, or you perish." In every sense, Amundsen's journey had reshaped the meaning of exploration. He had proven that success was not about strength alone, but about preparation, respect, and quiet courage. His triumph was not over nature, but within it. And while the South Pole stood as his crowning achievement, his true legacy was far greater, a reminder that even the smallest nation, and the quietest soul, can reach the farthest places on Earth, and in the human heart. In the years that followed his great triumph, Roald Amundsen continued to chase the horizon. Exploration was no longer just a mission for him, it was his identity, his very heartbeat. But fame brought both opportunity and burden. The world saw him as the man who had achieved the impossible, yet inside, he still felt the same restless spirit that had driven the boy from Norway's cold hills. He was not content to rest on glory. He longed to keep moving, northward, higher, further. In 1926, Amundsen took part in the first successful flight over the North Pole aboard the airship Norge. It was a remarkable technological leap. The age of exploration was shifting from ships to skies. For a brief moment, Amundsen once again stood at the forefront of discovery. But the world was changing, and explorers were no longer seen as heroes of survival, but as relics of a fading age. Funding became harder to find, and his later expeditions ended in frustration and financial strain. Then, in 1928, tragedy struck once more in the polar regions. The Italian explorer Umberto Nobile, with whom Amundsen had flown years earlier, crashed his airship in the Arctic. Despite the risks, Amundsen volunteered for the rescue mission. "I cannot sit idle while men are lost in the ice," he said. On June 18, 1928, his plane disappeared into the cold northern fog. It was never found. The man who had conquered both poles vanished into the very wilderness that had defined his life. In a way, his disappearance felt almost poetic, as if the ice had called him home. The same snow that had tested him now kept his final secret. Yet his legacy endures, not only in geography and science, but in the spirit of all who dare to dream beyond limits. What does Amundsen's life teach us today? Perhaps that true greatness is not loud or dramatic. It lies in discipline, humility, and purpose. It is the quiet voice that says, "Keep going, when everything around you says, stop. Amundsen never sought applause, he sought perfection. He planned every move, respected nature, and led with calm strength. His success was not built on luck, but on preparation, the kind that begins long before the world is watching. And maybe his greatest lesson is this: progress comes not from defying nature, but from understanding it. He learned from the Inuit, honored the elements, and proved that wisdom and respect are stronger than arrogance and pride. Through him, we see that exploration is not just about reaching distant places, but about discovering who we truly are. Today, when we look at the South Pole, that white, endless horizon, we remember the man who first set foot there. Roald Amundsen, the silent master of ice and wind, remains a symbol of human resilience, focus, and courage. His story reminds us that every great journey begins with a dream, continues through hardship, and ends, not with applause, but with peace. So, what can we take from Amundsen's story today? In a world driven by instant success and noise, his life reminds us of something timeless, that quiet focus often achieves what pride cannot. He did not chase fame or fortune, he pursued mastery. Every decision, every detail, every ounce of preparation reflected a deep respect for the forces he faced. And that is why his name endures, not as a man who sought to conquer the earth, but as one who learned to move in harmony with it. For English learners, Amundsen's journey is also a lesson in patience and persistence. Learning a language, like crossing an ice field, is a long, demanding path. There will be storms, setbacks, and moments of silence. But with steady steps, you can reach your own South Pole, that moment when what once felt impossible becomes part of who you are. So as you close this story, remember his words in action, if not in speech: preparation is victory. Respect is power. And discovery, true discovery, begins within. Thank you for joining this journey across the frozen world of courage and calm determination. This is WSE English Story, where learning English becomes a voyage through the extraordinary lives that shaped our world.